I would note members of the council are present virtually, and virtually because City Hall remains closed during Governor Inslee's stay home, stay healthy order, consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the public has been invited to attend the meeting virtually by using the Zoom meeting access information that's been on our both the meeting invite plus on our homepage. Everybody to mute your device, especially those listening in, to eliminate background noise as we go through the agenda. And with that, let's just jump into regular business. We've got 4 items on regular business. The first being the hazard mitigation plan update. And who would that fall to?
Actually, Mayor, we have the amended agenda tonight. So the first thing on the agenda is the zoning code text amendment for asphalt.
Got it.
We'll
Thank you. I pulled it up and didn't have that one. So zoning code text amendment. Do I call on you and Mr. Wilson, or?
Actually, Ryan can take this one.
Okay, Mr. Windish.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. So tonight is a follow-up meeting to the special meeting we had on last Wednesday, July 8th. And this meeting, at that meeting, we talked about the position that the city is in terms of the ordinance 2737 being postponed indefinitely, and the fact that the interim development regulations temporarily prohibiting asphalt batch plants in the city will expire next Monday, July 20th. And so the question is, how are we moving forward? And what we heard from, we heard a couple of amendments, one from Councilmember Newman, and I've provided, and I can go through a draft ordinance, or an updated amended ordinance, I should say, that shows those changes. But essentially the amendments involved requiring that the minimum noise level, which is 55 decibels, be the standard for asphalt batch facilities, as well as that the trucks be covered and enclosed, I think was the words, but I put covered in there. And then, bear with me while I double check what I wrote. And then I also want to add that the amendment also would retain a prohibition on asphalt batching as an accessory use in the East Sumner Urban Village general commercial zoning. So so what would happen there is section 10 then would be deleted from the ordinance, which would create no change in the current code where it's currently prohibited in GC. And finally, I want to point out that our city attorney, Andrea Marquez, made a change in section 13, making it a declared emergency so that this ordinance can go into effect immediately. Otherwise, it would take 5 days for it to go into effect, and it would allow for a property owner to potentially vest with an application before it became effective. So there'd be a gap between the interim development regulations expiring and this ordinance becoming effective. So there's now a declaration of emergency to make it become effective immediately. That I do believe requires a supermajority of the council on that vote. So that's in essence the amendments proposed by Councilmember Newman and summarized by me. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Charlotte, I guess I'd ask, since you're the ones that had brought forth the proposed amendments, whether you reviewed those items and whether they're what you intended.
I have. I would really like to thank. I think they captured very well what I was trying to accomplish, in which, for anyone watching, that was that we have for decades allowed asphalt plants in other parts of the town. This is really not related to the cordless text amendment, but where we currently allow asphalt batch plants, we did not have additional protections, and this does a good job of adding them. There are two minor things that I would like to bring up, but before I do that, Ryan, I want to make sure no one is confused. When you talked about general commercial, I would like to make it clear that this does nothing to actually change what is or isn't allowed in any zone, including general commercial on the east, Sumner neighborhood. And this simply changes, like adds protections to where it already is allowed, that we're not undoing anything that was done in August, et cetera.
Correct. Yeah, correct. It does not, it adds additional performance standards and conditions. Correct.
Okay, but doesn't change where it's allowed and where it's not allowed.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that everyone is clear on that part. And then, and thank you to staff, like they very close to nailed what was my request, particularly like with the sound levels, because we allow it in various zones. I wasn't sure if the lowest sound level was always going to be the standard. And so staff helped change to make sure that we'd always have like the lowest noise level available, which I think is important, particularly at nighttime. One slight change that was understandably missed that I would still like to include is number 3 in the items where it says be in compliance with regional, state, and federal air and emission levels. I requested that we meet or exceed regional, state, and federal air and emission levels. So simply that we meet or exceed. I think minor change that people had agreed on at the time. And then just for anyone else, for consistency's sake, I had actually requested, I think at the time it was like a permanent limitation on when trucks could operate. Like I wanted to exclude peak zones. That's not included here, which for reasons I understand. I'm not sure there was consensus on that, but also I am convinced that I understand that for legal purposes, that's something more difficult to dictate through code, and it is better approached through the CUP. So we'll just stay on top of it on future applications. But otherwise, thank you, staff, for doing this. I really think it was well done.
Just for clarification, I think, Charlotte, you're talking about section 7 under Q, item number 3.
Section 7 and 5. So Mayor, there's a couple of sections where, because we deal with different zones, the same sections are
Same section.
duplicated. Okay. The same standards are duplicated
right.
in different areas.
It'd be meet or exceed as opposed to in compliance with.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And I thank them for adding the protections for covering the trucks. That's where the smell comes from.
Okay. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Newman, I just want to make sure we have it exactly how you want it worded. It'd be meet or exceed regional, state, and federal air and emission levels. Okay. And then second, just to clarify, that's in...
and just for the record, I could see her thumbs up, but she said yes.
Thanks, Mayor. On the M2 zone, I would assume you'd want that same language.
Yeah, same language in all the areas where it's required. And especially since in M2, we are now going to make a CUP required instead of allowing it as an outright use. So yes, anywhere where we allow asphalt batch plant permitting, it should be with a CUP and these same standards in each zone.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
Okay, Charlie, you finished?
I am.
Okay, Patrick.
I had a question on the requirements. What does enforcement look like if complaints start coming in and if a violation is found? Which part would apply to that?
A little, I assume that, this is Ryan, I'm assuming that question's addressed at me. If complaints started coming in regarding noise or any of it, or?
Yeah, any of them. Should there be, understandably, complaints may come or go, but if a complaint comes in that is actually found to be found to discover a violation, what would apply at that point, as far as in any type of enforcement?
The city would, if we do an investigation and find that there's a code violation, we would send a letter to the property owner informing them that they were in violation. And then usually we send a first letter and then give them some time to comply. And then if there's no compliance, we follow up with a second letter, and it just kind of ratchets up until, you know, we're in court ultimately.
Is there a defined penalty or a specified action that takes place if, for example, if there were a consistent or persistent violation and it does reach the court level, is there a prescribed penalty for that?
Yeah, we have we have fines that accrue daily. They start out, stretching my knowledge here a little bit, but I mean, they get up to where you're charging $500 a day per violation. I mean, they are going to get property owners' attention if that's, and then those fines will, I mean, that gets their attention, that gets them in the room, talk about compliance, and hopefully that's, you know, they come into compliance and we're able to resolve it quickly. If not, we can continue to pursue it.
Oh, yeah, and I think that answers my questions. I just want to make sure that there was a mechanism for, because the goal is compliance, it's not to penalize. So to encourage the compliance. So unfortunately, I've seen many things in the past in another life that it was said, don't do that. But if you did it, there was no prescribed action. So I come across that almost every day.
And if I could just add, Councilman Reed, our enforcement procedures and ability to respond has increased quite a bit over the last couple of years, especially with second attorney, assistant city attorney on board. We are able to focus our attention more readily on follow-up, which is key to being effective. So we're doing, I would say, a lot better than we have in the past with more staff and some refined procedures.
So do any of the items in the amendment potentially revert back to state or federal authority to where the city can't actually do anything with it?
That's a good question. The Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, Department of Ecology, both those entities could potentially be involved in any violation.
Okay. But they wouldn't necessarily be the lead if it's in violation of city code?
Correct. No, the city would be in the lead on those.
Okay. That answers that question. I still have others on the topic, but I'll wait till this part's gone.
Okay, Andrea, I take it that Ryan answered or provided information that you were going to.
The only thing I was going to add is that in addition to monetary penalties, our code provides authority for stop work orders and stop use orders in really egregious violation cases. And we've employed that section of our code often. So the city has widespread authority to address violations when they occur.
And that's great. Thank you. And like I said, the goal is compliance. It's not penalty. So it's good to know that those are in place already. And
Okay, thank you. Any other, okay, Barb, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't really understand when you were talking about retaining the prohibition of asphalt batch plants in section 10. I mean, I didn't really understand what that was about. So if I could get that explained better.
Absolutely. So currently section 10, well, the simplest way to describe it, I think, is that the general commercial zoning currently prohibits asphalt batch plants. The ordinance would have allowed asphalt batch plants if approved with additional conditions. And so since it was changing from currently prohibited to allowed with conditions, if you want to prohibit asphalt plants, you need to keep the current code. So you have to take out section 10 and not make any changes.
So you're taking the whole section 10 out?
Yes.
In all those number of pages I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's correct.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead, Cindy.
My question is for Andrea Marquez, please. On section 13, with it having to pass with a supermajority, is there a way that doesn't have to be attached to this ordinance? Can it be a separate thing we vote on? The declaration of emergency?
No, unfortunately not. If the ordinance doesn't pass by a supermajority, then it'll default to the standard rule, which is that ordinances take effect 5 days after they're approved. So if the declaration of emergency is not included in the ordinance, then it cannot take effect immediately.
Okay, so what happens if we pass it, but it's not by supermajority?
It'll
I mean,
take
what's
effect 5 days later.
which will be,
Monday, the 27th, if we're talking about business days.
so it'd be a week after the interim development regulation expired.
It could potentially be. Now, the interim development regulation also took effect 5 days after it passed. So the timing will probably be just right, but to be safe so that a property owner cannot vest under the old code, it is important to have that language in this ordinance.
So how many votes does it take to pass this thing?
5 would be a supermajority for our council. And again, there's no obligation to have a supermajority. It just becomes effective immediately if there is approval by the supermajority.
So if it passes, it will become in effect.
Immediately.
But
If it passes by a supermajority, it will be effective immediately. You can pass this and not have a supermajority, in which case it becomes effective 5 days later, business days later.
and we're not worried about that leaving us open for something we don't want or
That's exactly why that language is included, because we've identified that there could potentially be a lag in the timing between the expiration of the IDR and the adoption of the new code if it's approved. So that's why we've included this language.
okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Other members of the council? Questions, comments? Councilmember Brown. Kurt, go ahead.
Hi. Hey, I like, Ryan said this, but then he took it back. I like the trucks to be enclosed rather than covered. Did you hear that? Anybody? Did that make sense? Enclosed.
I heard it. I don't know if it makes sense. I'm going to go back to Ryan.
I don't, maybe a little more explanation on what enclosed means. These are typically dump trucks,
Right.
not box trucks. So I'm not sure what enclosed means.
Well, I've seen the covered ones. Well, if they have technology to enclose them more, like a shower cap, you know, I would prefer that if they have that technology.
I can do a little research on what technology is out there for typically covering trucks and see how it sounds like you would like it to be more sealed up around the edges.
That's true.
I can investigate that.
Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Charlotte before we go back to you, Patrick. Go ahead, Charlotte.
I think I understand what Councilmember Brown is shooting for, and we might be able to clear it up here. If we use covered using the best or most secure available either technology or tools. Because I think what Councilmember Brown, I suspect, I can be corrected, is trying to avoid like a loose tarp situation. Yet you may not have like a complete concealed, like a dual shelled wall where it goes in. That could be probably prohibitive for businesses, but they do have new tightly concealed, like basically tightly sealed covers that go back on top of the trucks before they leave. And so I wonder if we just do it like using best available technology instead of disputing concealed versus covered. And I think that would avoid the loose tarp concerns. I don't know, but I think that's the hybrid. I could be wrong, like Councilmember Brown, if that doesn't address what you're trying to avoid, then let me know. But anyway, but that's what I suspect works.
Yeah, I'm all right with that. The covers I've seen are just a flat surface with the sides open. So the best technology would be fine.
I can make the change to the amendment then to include trucks shall be covered using best technology.
Best available technology.
Best available technology.
Yep. Okay. Anybody else that hasn't spoken before I go back to Patrick? Patrick, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in the sake of no surprises, I just wanted to let everybody know I've been speaking with Ms. Marquez and Mr. Windish about some other options for an amendment. It turns out initially my request was going to be prohibiting asphalt in the LDR RP zones in the east side, but that can't be done in that fashion that I found out today. So there are a couple of alternatives out there that might be able to be discussed, but I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but it'll be coming on Monday. And I'll have to follow up with Ryan and Andrea and try and flush that out to get as close to what I was looking to do as possible.
Okay, thanks for the heads up, Patrick. We appreciate it. Okay, anybody else? Questions or comments from council members? Okay, seeing none, you're going to make some fine tuning on this thing as a result of this conversation. Patrick's going to be working on the language that he would like to bring to the table next Monday. And Mr. Wilson, I see your hand raised.
Thank you, Mayor. If Andrea could quickly go over the process for next Monday, because it's going to be a little unusual for us.
I think that's a good suggestion. Andrea.
Well, I'll go over generally what I presume is going to happen, but I can't say that this will be the process Monday night. We'll go with the flow as things arise. First of all, the motion to postpone indefinitely this ordinance will need to be revived by Councilmember Newman or any council member who wishes to make that motion to revive it. It'll bring it back on the table, if you will. At that point, the ordinance will be presented by staff. Councilmember Newman will then make her motion to amend based on everything we heard tonight. If there's a second, then we will proceed. If there are additional amendments, like from Councilmember Reed or any other council member who wishes to make additional amendments on top of Councilmember Newman's, that would be the time after there's a motion and a second on the original amendment. And then you vote in reverse order on the amendments. So it seems counterintuitive, but if there's an amendment by Councilmember Reed, we'd vote first. Council would vote first on that. If it passes, it does away with the issue. If it fails, we go to Councilmember Newman's amendment. If it passes, we're done. If it fails, we go back to the original ordinance. So that would be the process Monday night. You vote in reverse order on any amendments that are on the floor.
Okay, any questions of Andrea? Cindy, go ahead.
Would the original ordinance then have the emergency clause in it?
No, it would be the original ordinance that was before you all the evening it was postponed indefinitely.
So would it take effect quick enough?
I don't imagine we'll get there. I don't believe there's a consensus among council to even vote on the original ordinance before Councilmember Newman's amendments.
Okay.
I think the question is with the amendments, would you have the emergency portion within the amended ordinance for consideration?
Yes, the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
And you
All right.
got that?
I think so. I just thought maybe that if we went as far as the original ordinance, we might need some speed along on that too, which then would require a supermajority, right? So but we don't think you don't anticipate that happening.
Just based on the discussions from the special study session on Wednesday and tonight, I don't anticipate that happening, but if it does, a council member could make an amendment to include that emergency language in there, and that would be important, and we would have that discussion Monday night.
But you would do it after we voted on it? You would have to do it before we voted.
Yeah, Cindy, I think that, again, it goes to this whole process, issue is that first you're considering the amendments. And were you to adopt the amendment, which includes the addition, amongst other things, of the declaration of emergency, then when you're voting on the whole ordinance, that's included because the amendment puts it within that. Okay.
Yes.
If that doesn't pass and you're left just with the ordinance in its present form, then what you could do is you can make an amendment to include a declaration of emergency. And if that passes, then it would be included and voted on.
All right. Thank you.
I think hopefully that was clear. I don't know. It's always dangerous to have me trying to clarify that versus the city attorney. Okay, Kathy.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna need this written down on paper or a personal assistant to help me with this. So if one could be in my box, that would be great.
You ain't the only one.
Yeah, and I'm like Kurt, I like pictures.
Well, I think in the past, in these virtual meetings, is that all of you have been given sort of the annotated, agenda. And I would think that everybody would have that available to them as we go through this thing so that we're all in the same process. Okay, anybody else? Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you. I actually have a procedural question regarding that flow that Andrea mentioned. In the event, so Councilmember Newman's amendment will be presented, and then assuming that I present a second amendment after that, if for some reason that one were to pass, it wouldn't negate Councilmember Newman's if it didn't address all the same areas, would it?
No, that is correct. My response was initially based on what I thought your proposed amendment might be based on our discussion last week, but it sounds like it's changing. And so I'm unsure what your amendment will bring. If it is not a prohibition citywide in all zones, then you're correct. It would not do away entirely with the ordinance. It would just be a double amended ordinance by both of you.
Okay, and I think that's some of the unanswered questions I need to talk to you and Ryan about during the week on how to formulate that in coherent words.
Sounds good.
Therein lies the challenge, Patrick. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? Seeing none. Okay. Sounds like we have some work to do during the week before considering it next Monday. Okay, now, Jason, I got me back on track now that I'm looking at the amended agenda. Now we're to the hazard mitigation plan update. And Who's going to make that presentation?
Mr. Windish will also make that one.
Mr. Windish.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. See if this works. Wait a minute. Can everybody see my screen? All right. So I talked about this last fall, the 2020.
Brian, you also have shown the next slide, and I don't know if that's your intent.
No, probably not. So, do you see a cover slide?
I see your cover slide, then I see the hazard mitigation plan slide in smaller form next to it saying next slide.
We see the presenter view.
Oh,
You're on the wrong screen.
I'm on the wrong screen.
Yeah, do a new share with your other screen.
All right. Let me start over.
Thank you, Ryan.
Looks right now?
Yes, it does.
Very good. So I want to share with you the update to our hazard mitigation plan. We update this plan every 5 years, and 2020 is the year for this one. It'll take us out to 2025. The hazard mitigation plan is required by FEMA. It's one of the most important things for making sure it's one of the most important things about the plan is that it is tied to mitigation funding and post-disaster funding. So we need to have a plan in place in the event that there's a disaster of some sort that we want to get reimbursed for from FEMA. We need to have a hazard mitigation plan in place. We collaborate heavily with Pierce County Department of Emergency Management. In fact, their staff does a great job of wrangling a number of jurisdictions to pull these things together. They're updates, so there's a lot of text and language already in there, but it all has to be reviewed and then compiled and then turned into the State Department of Emergency Management for review, as well as FEMA for review. And with the pandemic and the emergency response to that worldwide event, both those agencies are running a little bit behind on reviewing our plan, but I think it's better to adopt the plan. And then if there are some small changes, we come back and make those changes because the plan actually expires at the end of this month. So I don't want to wait for that to happen. What does the plan do? It identifies vulnerabilities and threats. So natural disaster threats, and I'll go through some of those. By the time I get done, you'll probably want to sell your property in Sumner and move to someplace else. But I can tell you that there's no hurricanes or tornadoes on the list. So just so you know that. The plan also identifies the capabilities and infrastructure, capabilities for the city as well as our critical infrastructure. And then a key part of the plan is that it lists out various mitigation measures, things that we need to be as a city thinking about funding and putting in place in order to reduce the impacts of a natural disaster should one occur. And then we've also attempted to involve the public in this process. It's not a super engaging topic, so we haven't gotten a lot of public involvement, but nonetheless, we have attempted to do that. What are some of the vulnerabilities and threats in our city? You're all familiar, I think, with flooding, the fact we live in the shadow of Mount Rainier. Earthquakes, landslides occur, especially in Sumner along the valley edge. Hazmat spills. We have a pipeline that runs through Sumner, a big pipeline, the Olympic pipeline that carries natural gas through several states. There can be transportation hazards. We have 2 railroads that run through Sumner and 2 highways, so things can happen on those places, in those places. We also live below Mud Mountain Dam, so dam failure is real. And then there's always the threat of terrorism. This is one of our flood maps. I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but the purple area shows our 100-year floodplain. So that's 1% chance in any given year of flooding. Our Volcanic and Lahar hazard area, which is the path of Lahar's mud flows that have occurred from Mount Rainier that have covered the valley floor from wall to wall and ended up in Puget Sound. Earthquake and seismic areas. We also have areas that have a lot of peat and high groundwater tables, namely along the edges of the valley floor, that are susceptible to what's called liquefaction. So during an earthquake, the ground would soften up and become gooey like mud, and it causes buildings to settle, and a lot of damage can occur in that regard. So those are some of the major hazards. I didn't want to go through all of them. Mitigation measures that are in the plan or were discussed during preparation of the plan. Bridge replacement and retrofit. So that's something we've been doing and continue to have on the list. The removal of the Bridge Street Bridge was partly a mitigation measure, built a safer bridge. The White River restoration plan that Doug Beagle and Public Works and everybody in that regard has been working on is also in the plan. Setback levies are other ideas, protecting essential public records, cybersecurity, auxiliary power. So generators, backup generators for critical facilities like our water system, our sewer system, also important. Continuing public education, undergrounding utilities. Our subdivision code requires that new subdivisions have underground utilities. So you can imagine that keeps them from being knocked down in the wind and windstorms that we have quite often in the winter. Recovery planning, ham radio operators even is important resource to have during a disaster. Sometimes that's the only way you can communicate effectively with the outside world. So those are some of the mitigation measures listed, and what I want to say is, these are the things that over time we want to implement to fund to make sure that they're happening. Next steps, I had mentioned that the state and FEMA are reviewing our plans, and I hope to get a response back before the 20th. But if we don't, my recommendation would be that we adopt the plan, and if we need to, we can come back and make some minor changes based on FEMA's comments. So the federal deadline is the 22nd. Happy to answer any questions. It will be in front of the council for approval with a resolution on July 20th.
Ryan, I know that Pierce County and talking to some of their departments is that there's this virus going around and, pandemic, and they are, directing some of their departments to, apply for reimbursement through FEMA. So is that something that is covered under the hazard mitigation plan, or is that another avenue?
We should probably update our plan to include that, I'm guessing. It's not in there right now, but clearly given the past events that we've had, they call it an all hazards mitigation plan. So I'm going to assume a pandemic is one of those hazards, not unlike a terrorist threat, that kind of thing, but it's not currently in the plan.
Okay, Jason.
Thanks, Mayor. Pandemics are also covered under our comprehensive emergency management plan, which is also approved by the federal government and the state. And we have been working through the process of applying for federal aid through FEMA for our COVID response.
Good, thank you, Jason. Okay, questions, comments, council members of Ryan on the hazard mitigation plan update? Okay, seeing none, I take it that we will see that at the next regular council meeting. Okay, cool. Okay, we'll move on to council budget overview. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to have Cassandra pull up the presentation, and you're going to be hearing from me, Chief Financial Officer Cassandra Raymond, and Admin Services Director Jeff Steffens on this item. Next slide, please. So tonight we're going to be kicking off our 2021-2022 biennial budget process. So just a little bit of a reminder, what is a budget? It's just a list of numbers. It's not just a list of numbers. It actually establishes a plan of policy and operations. Think of this as the most public document that we do that shares what the city is going to do over the next 2 years, and also what it's done over the past 2 years. It facilitates the evaluation of city programs, and it provides management information, establishes financial control, and like I said, serves as a broad communications document. Next slide. As we go through this presentation tonight, I'd like all of you to keep in mind what our mission is, and that's to provide needed and valued services that promote our sense of community. We all know that we're going through a pandemic and an associated recession, and this is the time when we have to look at our budget and see what lines up with our mission and make sure that we continue to provide those services that are so vitally important to our community. Next slide. Council strategic priorities. This was something that we were going to revisit in late February, April rather, as the pandemic started. We actually had a council retreat scheduled to sit down with council and go over what the strategic priorities are to make sure that they are still relevant to today. We've gone through this process multiple times over the last several years as we go through budget processes, and they seem to always still resound with our elected leaders. And I think if council tonight feels that they are no longer appropriate or they need to be amended, that's something that we should start discussing sooner than later, because they really do help justify budget decisions, not only as staff build the budgets, but as council considers it into the future. So just as a reminder, our strategic priorities are safe and efficient transportation system, protection of water, open spaces, and natural resources, the long-range financial stability to provide a balance of city services, and enhancing the community character. With that, I'll turn it over to Cassandra Raymond, who will go through the next several slides. And Cassandra, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. So Mr. Wilson was talking a little bit about, we had a council workshop scheduled in February to begin our discussions on the 2021-2022 biennial budget. And when we had initially scheduled that and started talking about planning for that workshop, we really were looking at this next biennium through a much different lens than what we're looking at it now. We were in a position where we were going to be able to really kind of explore some of the options that we had for services and programs. And now, just in the space of very few months, we're in a position where we are just being very conservative and almost retrenching to ensure continuity of services going forward. So one of the first things we do as we come into a new budget cycle is we take a look at our general fund. We take a look at our general fund financial model. The general fund is the fund that really, it covers everything that's not legally required to be in a different fund. So our general fund is our main operations fund. And where we're at right now is really looking at what is the impact going into this biennial budget that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on our general fund. And so here we have our general fund financial model. I've laid in our non-recessionary revenue and expenditures, as well as what the revenues and expenditures are looking like coming into more of a recessionary environment for this biennial budget. You can see 2020, we're seeing a large drop. I mean, really just a jump off of a cliff as far as our revenues go. And then we've already opened our budget toolbox to adjust our expenditures to mitigate what that impact is of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that we're always talking about and we're always looking at when we're looking at our financial model is the big question is, when do the lines cross? And that's, when do our operating revenues no longer support our operating expenditures? And that's what we refer to as a structurally balanced budget. When you're not relying on one-time revenues or fund balance to cover your operating expenditures, we always want to be in a place where our operating revenues are covering our operating expenditures. And the funding mechanisms have been structurally unbalanced for quite some time. As you know, property tax is limited by RCW and doesn't keep up with inflation. And a lot of our other revenues also don't keep up with inflationary increases in our expenditures. So we've always kept an eye on when do those lines cross. And what we're seeing is those lines are beginning to cross sooner rather than later. And it's something that we're keeping in mind as we're moving through this biennial budget process. When we look specifically at the
Ms.
impact,
Sandberg,
yes,
could you go back?
Yep.
I just want to make sure everybody understands what they're looking at. The dashed lines were your original revenue and expenditure projections
right,
prior to the recession.
right,
And then the revised lines down below where it takes the dip are the corresponding ones with the recession. But both of them, I mean, the one assumption that you have there is that we recover back in terms of those trend lines by 2021. Is that correct?
yes. So what we're seeing is we are looking at, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what that recovery is going to look like, whether or not that recovery is going to be kind of a smooth curve out or a sharper curve up. And this is really planning on a smoother curve out, but we are seeing that just based on estimates, and this will be revised as we move further. The lines are still crossing at the same place. We're just seeing a more immediate impact.
Okay, thank you.
So when we look specifically at the economic impact of the pandemic, looking at our expenditures first, we have our COVID-19 costs. This is through June 30th. So we have incurred a fair amount of costs that we can relate specifically back to the pandemic. In premium pay, this was pay for essential workers to be reporting to the city under phase 1, a little over $61,000. Our CARES emergency sick leave. I'm sorry, Merritt, it looked like you were ready to say something. Okay. So our CARES emergency.
Stifling a yawn, sorry.
Hey, this is exciting stuff. It's budget. So our emergency sick leave, this is the emergency sick leave provided by the federal government under the CARES Act. We've incurred about $21,000. Supplies, about $16,000. And then on our direct response cost, and this is staff time that's been tracked specifically to responding to COVID-19. It's not necessarily overtime, but it's staff time that could have been spent on regular operations of the city. So really it's a lost opportunity cost. It's time that has been spent responding to COVID versus doing what our normal business is. Looking at some of our funding mechanisms and as far as the ability to recoup any of these costs, they're limited. We have CARES funding through the federal government that was passed down through the state and the county. That is a little over $300,000. Part of that is funding the Sumner CARES program, facilitated through the Family Center and Rotary for rent, mortgage assistance, and utility assistance for the community. And then we'll be applying to have some of our labor costs reimbursed through the CARES fund as well. We don't anticipate that funding will wholly cover our costs. As far as the supplies, Mayor Pugh mentioned that Mr. Wilson mentioned that we had been working through FEMA. And so we are looking at getting reimbursement for our supply costs through FEMA. And that's about a 75% participation rate. And for anyone that is curious, that is a fun process. Taking a look at our forecasting, and this is a slide that we keep going back to because it's still very relevant. We try and do the best job we can with forecasting. It's difficult. It's difficult in the best of times. The pandemic is making it making it even more difficult. We don't know what the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months is going to look like. Taking a look, comparing what's happening now to the Great Recession in 2008, that recession had a much more structural base. The losses and the recovery followed a bell curve, and it was difficult and it was painful and it was hard, but it was also predictable in some ways. We had a good idea of what the losses were. We saw them right there, and then we had a good idea of where we were going with the recovery. The 2020 recession is a whole different ballgame. We haven't seen a cause like this. I mean, it really is an unprecedented situation. It's worldwide, and it was an almost instant drop off in the economy. And then again, with the uncertain recovery, not only is the recovery dependent on when various phases reopen, but consumer behavior is going to have a huge impact on what the recovery looks like. And really where we see that is in our revenues. We have almost all of our revenues are impacted. We really don't have anything immune from being impacted. Our sales tax is a huge portion of our general fund. It's the biggest revenue source into our general fund. It's about 40% of our general fund revenues for 2020, and it's taken a dive off the cliff. We have been very, very fortunate. I will say that we have had several one-time revenues that have come in that have helped supplement some of the loss that we've seen in our regularly remitting businesses. I'm thankful every day for that. It's nice to see, but they're one-time revenues. They're not things that we can count on happening in any future months. We know that directly because of the pandemic, the streamlined sales tax mitigation that we fought so hard to retain has been vetoed by the governor. And so that is a direct cash loss to the city. Our property tax, although we consider property taxes to be one of our most collectible revenues, the timing has been impacted. The auditor's office has provided an extension on that timing, and that's an impact to cash flow. Our motor vehicle fuel taxes, that's a revenue stream that supports our street operations, which is part of our general fund. That's based on the number of gallons sold. It doesn't have a correlation to the price per gallon, but just the number of gallons. And with more people staying home and telecommuting and staying safe at home, we're just not seeing the number of gallons that we had anticipated. Our real estate excise taxes, while not a general fund, that's what really supports a lot of our capital program. And that's dependent on real estate activity. Building permits and fees has been impacted. Utility taxes, as some of our customers are having difficulties with their utilities, and we see impacts to those revenues are the base for the utility tax that's paid into our general fund. And so it impacts not only our utility funds, but our general fund as well. Other charges for service, and then state and federal capital grants. This is a worldwide pandemic. It's had a worldwide economic impact. And as our state and federal funding partners are impacted as well, that dries up some of the opportunities that we have to pursue federal or state funding for our capital programs. Going back to our sales tax, when we look at our sales tax, the blue line was our 2020 adopted. Our red line is our 2020 pre-COVID or actual. So it matches up with the actuals that we received. And then 2020 is our COVID forecast. And our COVID forecast is based on, we really took a look at the 2018 actuals, which helped strip out some of the growth from 2019, just to stay on this side of conservative, and then a percentage. And it's a gradual percentage. So 45% of our 2018 collections beginning in August, and then slowly ramping up. You can see that our June collection for April was the actuals were right where we would expect them to be. And again, I can't stress enough, it looks good on the graph, but it literally was the result of 2 or 3 one-time large transactions that we have no anticipation of seeing again. And then going forward, we can see the gap between what we truly expect to see from our regular remitters compared to what our adopted was and what our forecasts were pre-COVID. Any questions on this graph?
Question. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you. Cassandra, would it be possible, because after the next update or subsequent updates come, that we can put the graph into a timeline where we're projecting at this point, you know, as of today, we expect or anticipate it to take the drop for July or bottom out toward July, and kind of see how that trends? Whether or not it follows consistent with what's being predicted today, or if some unforeseens come up and we actually trend either better or worse than what we're anticipating right now, just so we can kind of put into a timeline.
Yes, so I will update this. Our next remittance will come on July 31st. So I will update this then, and we'll have that additional month of data, and I can add that timeline in.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that way it just gives us kind of because I know there's a lot of uncertainty in the projecting for this round because it's so unusual and unseen that the revenues could go just about anywhere. It could take a deeper dive than what it's showing, or it could start leveling out. It's hard to, or somewhere in between.
Yeah, and it really could, and I think that's one of the reasons that we've tried to be conservative. Is it's much easier to be able to expand your programs and services than it is to be too optimistic, implement something, and have to dial it back very quickly. So we're trying to balance that with not being so conservative that we shoot ourselves in the foot.
And you guys do a great job with that, I have to say. Every time we get the update or the report, it's very realistic, and it's not pie in the sky type stuff. It's pretty straightforward with, this is where it's at, this is where we think it's going to be. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's a little bit more difficult these days.
Yeah, I echo those comments, Patrick. I think it's much better to be on the conservative side as you move forward, and as opposed to overly optimistic to where then you have to take drastic action. It just doesn't make sense from a budget standpoint.
So as we come into the biennial budget, one of the things we always like to take a look at is our budget toolbox. Our budget toolbox includes, on the expenditure side, reducing our expenditures and or our service levels. It sounds awfully simplistic, but it's a lot harder to do. And deferring operational and or capital assessments. These all have their pros and cons, and we could sit and we could discuss them for hours. On our revenue side, we always hearing grow the pie with new revenues. It is so much more difficult than it sounds, but that is one of the things that we're always looking to do. And then increasing our existing revenue streams. I will say we've already kind of opened the toolbox for our tier 1 toolbox. So, and that's the budget amendment that council passed at its last study session. And really that was going through and making adjustments specifically under this COVID-19 pandemic. They were programs that we're not able to offer, such as the summer programs. Due to the pandemic, we were able to make those adjustments, as well as making some other adjustments that were not things that we necessarily wanted to do, such as reducing the street pavement rehab programs, but things that we knew that we needed to do to kind of get through this this initial impact. I will say that over the past 6 to 10 years, we've already gone through and we've already eliminated a lot of the low-hanging fruit. There's not a whole lot left to reduce in our day-to-day kind of core service expenditures. I know we've done a lot of really, really cool things as far as maintaining and increasing our service levels by partnering with other agencies, such as Stafford Suites for the Senior Center, the interlocal we have for court processes. And it's something that we're always looking at, and we look at closely every budget cycle. It's difficult. It's difficult to find continuing ways to make those expenditure reductions without impacting our service levels.
Cassandra, Jason wants to make a comment. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to reemphasize something that Cassandra said. When we talk about new revenues and growing the pie, that's really adding more either property tax or sales tax contributors to the overall pie. And like Cassandra said, that sounds really simple, but even if we look at what is, kind of those ingredients that we know are coming into our pie here, hopefully in the next 2-3 years, that, we've talked about to council about future development in the north end and even in the downtown area. I want to be clear, we still have a structural problem that we have to overcome. Our revenues will continue to outpace, our expenditures will continue to outpace our revenues, despite what we're likely to see from new businesses coming to town. The numbers don't work that way. So we're gonna have to look at other things than just growing the pie through new businesses.
And as I recall, when we first started, going through those projections, which several years ago, it's probably out to 2025, 2026. And then as we've moved along, the lines have intersected on a sooner rather than later. So now we're at 2023.
So this is our base toolbox. I said we've kind of already done that level 1 toolbox of doing our budget amendment, going through and making really kind of surgical reductions in response to the pandemic. Some of the other changes that can be made are changes in our service levels. We can defer our costs, such as deferring our interfund loan payments for a year, deferring assessments to building reserves or other operating assessments, and then reductions in our labor force and benefit changes, furloughs, layoff, early retirement. Those are all options on the table. I will say that those are all things that are one-time, especially the deferral of cost. And these are all things that may put us in a weaker position going forward. So these are things that we would consider much more serious, kind of that next level of the toolbox options. Some of the other options are increasing our existing revenues, increasing rates and fees. That's always a balancing act. We want to remain friendly and accessible, especially in things like our building permits, other services and fees. Property tax bank capacity. There is a small amount of bank capacity still remaining for tax year 2020. It was under $250,000, but that is something we could access. I will say that's not a quick fix. If we access that bank capacity in our resolution this fall, we wouldn't see those revenues until 2021. Growing the pie, as Mr. Wilson just mentioned, identifying and adding new revenue streams is great on paper. It's harder to do in real life. And again, it's not a quick fix. It's not something that you can put in place this month and start seeing revenues next month. And then we have some existing fund sources that are available based on council direction. We have a general reserve fund that is about $980,000 that was put in place years ago. We've heard it called the reserve fund, heard it called the rainy day fund. That can be accessed with a council supermajority, and that was the way it was written in the ordinance. We have the City Council Strategic Reserve Fund, and that is beginning in 2017. We started putting away a portion of the property tax level in a reserved account for City Council to program as part of the biennial budget process. We have general fund balance that is available. And again, it's a one-time revenue. It's really an analog to dipping into your savings account to cover your operating expenditures. And it's not something that we really like to do, but that is available. And then utilizing funds from the Red Apple property sale. The property was sold this year. Those funds have not been appropriated for use. That's something that we have, I know, talked about on several informal occasions about perhaps staff has talked about having those funds help offset the general fund contribution or participation in the Public Works Operations facility. That facility will be streets, water, sewer, and storm. And of course, the streets portion is a portion of the general fund. When we talk about the City Council Reserve Fund, I said it was originally established in 2017 for tax year 18. is for council appropriation in a future budget cycle, and then funds are restricted from any other purpose without council approval. The balance at the end of this year will be a little over $1 million. Then I am going to turn it over to Mr. Steffens.
Thank you. As Cassandra and Jason mentioned, not only did COVID-19 affect the content of the budget, but it's also going to affect the construction of the budget. We're tasked with putting a two-year budget together while we're all, working remotely from our homes, not able to get together and meet in person. Cassandra, can you go to the next slide, please? The budget process will remain the same. We'll start with input from the community and the council. We've been gathering community input throughout last year as well as earlier this year, and we'll be getting some council input this evening. That will go towards the staff, which will be submitting department proposals for the mayor to review, approve, deny, or modify, and then back again to the community and the council for input, and then finally to adoption, hopefully later this year. So as Cassandra likes to say, every day is budget engagement day. Pretty much everything that we do at the city involves the budget. There's always funding behind all the things that go on. So we've done some engagement, things like Rhubarb Days, Sumner University, even things like youth forums, the community summit, Sumner Connects, and open houses all touch on the budget and priorities of the budget. We have done some very specific community engagement. The Sumner Connects page on the budget had an online survey this year. It's the first time that we've done the budget survey fully online, and we received approximately 70 responses to that. The budget has been featured in the spring and summer newsletters, and it was also part of our virtual open house. So I'm going to go over quickly some of the survey results. The first question here was, how would you spend an additional $100? And as you can see, the public was pretty evenly split between their top priorities of streets and traffic and public safety, with parks, open space, managing growth, and environmental issues kind of coming in a tie for third, as well as human services and recreation. The numbers on the bottom with the arrows show the changes from the 2018 survey, and you can see the dollar amounts as how that $100 would be broken up. Next from the survey is the feeling of safety. As you can see, Sumner residents feel that the city is very, very safe during the day, with over 81% saying it's very safe and another 17% feeling somewhat safe. Even at night, the somewhat safe and very safe pie is quite large. And as you can see, those percentages have increased from the 2018 numbers. Next is the overall satisfaction with city services. This is the percentage of the people that are satisfied. As you can see, most services that the city provides are well regarded within the community. The numbers in the green are the numbers from 2018. You can see things like overall police service, the percentage satisfied has increased since 2018. Other things, we've had some slight drops like conditions of roads, and there was a big increase with the ability to get to other places, which is nice. So the survey respondents came back with what their top 5 priorities were. Number 1 is preventing crime, protecting the community. Number 2 is ensuring prompt police response times, which those are quite similar. Number 3 is managing growth, followed by maintaining streets. And then a new one is promoting traffic and bike and pedestrian safety. As you can see, the numbers in parentheses are where these priorities ranked on the 2018 survey.
Okay, just a second here. Go ahead, Melanie.
What does managing growth mean?
That would be a good question for a planner. I'm sorry, I don't know the context of how they came up with these. I think that these were listed options and they were kind of able to arrange them in their priority order. And it was just one of the kind of canned responses on there. But I would say it would go towards development, managing development, urban sprawl.
Yeah, I think it's something that could use further definition in the future.
I see Carmen has her hand raised and she is the one that created the survey. So she would probably be able to give a much more educated answer than I could.
Go ahead, Carmen.
Oh, but I think I have to upgrade her. Just one moment.
While Jeff's upgrading her, I will say, you know, we've used the same survey for a number of years, so we can compare year over year. But I do understand we're managing growth. Something that vague could be one way or the other. Carmen, you on?
Hi there. Yes, here, I guess I can do my video too so you can see me. I guess not. There we go. These set items came from a much larger survey that was part of the 2015, I believe, Ryan, 2015 comp plan amendment process. And that was a very open-ended survey where we asked questions like, if you were to recommend moving to Sumner to a friend, what would you say? And Ryan took the time, that one had hundreds of answers, and Ryan took the time to consolidate all these various open-ended answers that individuals provided into themes. And these were the themes that then we test on the budget survey. It's a pretty good process, but I think to Councilmember Peterson's question, we did look at that managing growth one and kind of go, what exactly did people mean by that when they said that? So for this sake of this, we were in the middle of coronavirus. We let it ride one more time because you do want your surveys to be fairly consistent so you can track trends. But I have a feeling in 2 years, we will redefine that, figure out what the right words for that are, or ask a few more questions to help us get to what people mean by that.
Thanks, Carmen.
I'll also add that we will send council the full survey results, because a lot of times the comments help give insight as to why people chose these as their priorities or concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think that would be really helpful, because I agree with Melanie. You just look at managing growth, and there's a lot of facets to managing growth, and maybe by diving into the information that you provide, you get a little better insight. And it's a good thing to keep in mind for the future, to try to further define what those priorities mean.
Thank you. Cassandra, can you go to the next slide, please? Next was the list of their favorite things about Sumner. As you can see, small town atmosphere, an overall safe feeling. The fact that it's walkable has increased, the downtown itself, and then the general cleanliness of the town is things that they like about Sumner. And then followed by the concerns. Top 2 concerns, traffic and crime, followed by condition of roads, damage and missing sidewalks, and parking. As you can see, parking dropped from number 4 to number 5, and I think part of that was due to the timing with COVID. There's obviously less of a parking struggle than there is normally. Then the next question was, do you feel that Sumner is going in the right direction? As you can see, it was pretty evenly split between unsure and yes, we are. And this was a big change from the numbers in white that were the 2018 percentages. Unfortunately, we talked about this, and I don't know the exact context of why people were unsure, or whether we were going in the right direction, or what the change was, but it's just something to point out.
So Jeff, when you look at that, the no, we're not, it's pretty consistent, but there was 20 basis points shift between yes, we are to unsure.
Correct.
Okay. And we don't particularly know why that happened.
No.
Okay.
Mayor, I could add one possible insight too, that this is the first year we did it all online, and we actually had a significant decrease in the number of responses to the survey. And we're not sure if that's because it was online or the pandemic or a combination of both.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
The general mood of probably everyone right now is a high level of being unsure. So I'm not surprised that kind of moved into our survey results this year. So again, the process review, currently we're in the staff is working on creating their department proposals. Those are due to finance department by next Monday. So the 3 of us that are on this meeting this evening have given out a directive to departments with the help of the mayor. And really what we're looking for is a status quo budget. We've asked departments to hold all their discretionary costs. So things like office supplies, small tools, equipment, really keep them at a 0% lift where feasible. We've asked them to remove any special one-time budget items from the previous budget. Just because you bought a truck last year doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get one this year. And any new or expanded programs must have identify reduced expenditure or revenue offset for those to be considered. We do have some challenges moving forward. We have several things that are unfunded, like mentioned, the general fund portion of the Operations Center for Public Works, and there's trail maintenance and repairs currently unfunded. We also have some other items that are underfunded, like street maintenance, sidewalk improvements, playground replacement, and building reserves. Once again, just to remind you, our mission is to provide the needed and valued services that promote our sense of community. But really the question is how do we know what's needed and valued? And now Jason's going to discuss City Council priorities.
Let's try that again. Thanks, Jeff. So we know this is a lot of information. And like we said before, our hope was to have a nice council retreat and really go through some of these things. But obviously the pandemic has changed a lot. And what we're looking for right now is anything that council knows that is important to them that you would like to see in the budget. And you know, departments are working on them now, but it's certainly not too late to provide some input to help us form the budget proposals that are going to the mayor. So what we're looking for is any significant policy changes or changes in programs or services. And this could be expansion or contraction of any of these items. And, you know, while we'd like input tonight, if you think of something in the next couple of weeks, please reach out to me and we'll be happy to start looking into that and considering it. What we really don't want is a significant policy change or change in program and service at the council level in November. That's a lot harder for us to kind of unwind the budget and try to make something work. So the sooner we know about these, the easier it is for us to incorporate them into the budget. So with that, I'll open up the floor.
Okay, any questions, comments, statements? Questions, comments, statements. They're all, no hands raised, no waving at me through your, oh, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy. Go ahead.
Would it be up to the council to put forward the council, I'm not sure what we called it, our council fund? Would it be up to us to put that into the mix on the money, or is that something the mayor decides and then we yay or nay to, or?
Hey, the council, your $1 million+ is the council's dollars. I'm not going to make any presumptions as to its use, unless you all want me to. I could certainly do that, but that's really a council fund.
When would we have a discussion as a group? Because that's normally what we would have done at the retreat. Talk about whether it was, you know, valid to put it forward at this time. So would that be on a study session for us, or something that we can have some back and forth discussion on it sometime?
I think we're always open for that. I think it's up for council members to bring forth suggestions and have a discussion, you know, amongst themselves. And it ain't around a table in a room, but it certainly can take place, you know, virtually and have those discussions. And if there's some work that staff has to do, they can also do that. I think the one thing you have to remember is that these are one-time funds. You know, your $1 million+ it's sort of like a reserve sitting in there. And I think you're contributing, what is it, about a third of a million per year into it. And so you could look at it as having a little over $1 million of available with an ongoing contribution of around, you know, a third of $1 million, you know, per year. And of course, the only caveat to that is if you get to 2023 and you start with those lines crossed, you continue putting that council reserve dollars into the reserve, because you're going to be more hard pressed from, you know, a service provision standpoint. Did that help, Cindy? I don't know.
Yeah, but I will state that when we did that, I really thought that council was reserving it for times of real need. And I honestly feel that this may have been a emergency we never would have foreseen, but that it would have been this might be a time and an option for us to contribute that, so that citizens don't see a drop in services or in the amount of staff we have and those sort of things. So it's something I'd like to bring forward at some time.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. Melanie.
Continuing on Cindy's point, I'm looking back at the slide that shows, you know, the next steps, which I appreciate the highlight on where we're at. But from what I'm understanding from what Jason just shared and from that graphic, that this is it pretty much for council. Are we going to have other study sessions to talk about it? Because it goes to the mayor, then it comes back to us to essentially approve it at that point, because it's difficult at the end to change something. So if that's the case, go ahead, Jason.
So you have a lot of opportunities to look at the budget. But,
well, sure.
But tonight and probably in the next 2 weeks is the most ample time to, if there's significant policy changes. When I say significant policy changes, I mean significant changes to wages, benefits, number of employees, maybe a significant change that you want to increase, decrease road maintenance. Those things that we need to know sooner than later so we can start building them into the budget.
Got it.
And to Cindy's point, this I think will answer your question as well, Councilmember Peterson. You have the $1 million sitting in that strategic fund, but it's also going to be a decision that council is going to have to make in November when you look at property tax rates. Do you want to continue diverting that $350,000 into that fund, or do you want to roll it into the general fund revenues that are unrestricted and can be used for maybe some of the policy changes that council may want to make? I would still leave a bit of money there that could be used for a project or something, either for emergency fund or a capital improvement, for example.
So from a forward-looking standpoint, right here, you're saying, Jason, is you've got that $1/3 that, you know, could be used for the ongoing expenses associated with like a position or a program that would move into the future, either all or a portion of that.
Correct.
Does that help, Melanie?
It does. I have another question though. Given that we didn't have the retreat and it's more difficult for us to get together as council members, what tools are available to us, like a Google Doc or something like that, where we can have those headline items, you know, like Cindy's pointing out, the council fund, like Jason pointed out, staffing, those types of things. Like, what can we share together as a council to keep track of things that we might want to change on policy or not?
I think the biggest challenge with a Google Doc or an email string is violating the Open Public Meetings Act. So
right.
Really the time for that is at the committee level or at a study session. And that could be something that the Finance Committee takes a little extra effort looking at, or we can put it on another study session for open suggestions.
I would love this to be on another study session after each committee has it as an agenda item to thoroughly think through and discuss.
Yeah, I would probably reluctantly agree, because I can hear Jason's mind going as the weeks go by. But I think there needs to be some internal discussion with the committees, and then bringing it back to study sessions so that things can be thoroughly vetted and thoroughly thought about, you know, prior to moving forward. That puts you in a bind, I know, Jason, in terms of process, but But it is some money that you're talking about here that is the council's money, that is, you know, at their discretion. And I know there's implications when it goes on to other areas, but somehow we have to figure out how to have a conversation on it that, you know, people can feel that they got the issues on the table and they're thoroughly vetted, and we know that we're moving forward in a collective manner.
I think my preference would be that we put it on a study session sooner than later and bypass committees. And I only say that because we're almost into August. Council or department budgets are due Monday. We are set to review budgets with the mayor the first and second week of August. And then it's going to start rolling into regular council meetings at the end of August with the rate model for utilities. So we're not that far away from it coming back to council to actually start looking at the final or the draft budget at that point. So I would propose we put this right back on the next study session agenda for council to.
I think, yeah, we need to have the council's thoughts and comments. So you're going to have to get those to Jason, and so there can be a collective discussion of what all those are at the next study session. And then I don't know, we're going to see where we are at that point. It's easy to say we'll have one more and we'll be able to come to some consensus, but I don't know till we get to that point. Anyway.
I'll also add that we're looking at preparing this budget a little bit differently than we have in years past, only because of the uncertainty with the pandemic. We're going to kind of come up with some different decision models, right? And that's something that we're going to be working with the mayor on, and there might be an opportunity to bring some of those decisions, which may include something like accessing that $350,000. That might be a future council decision point in the budget process, which is a little differently than what we've done in the past.
Patrick.
Thank you, Mayor. If staff is looking for kind of a taking the temperature, which way the wind is blowing type, I could put out there from the hip that I would be open to using some of those council strategic funds as one-time supplements to offset COVID impacts for things very specifically streets and sidewalks and public safety. Those would be two of my higher priorities in maintaining items, at least through until we know what's going to happen with COVID. I'm not even close to the point of supporting going into our bank capacity. There is still way too much unknown for that and what the turnaround times for the economy are looking like. I'm not saying it's off the table, but I'm saying I'm not even close to that at this point. Maybe in a mid-buy, but that just putting it out there, that's where I would be. And using some of those funds, not necessarily depleting it, but trying to offset any potential cuts that we might be looking at streets, sidewalks, and public safety. I would absolutely be interested in seeing that.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. We're going to call on Kathy next and then Barb. Kathy.
Yeah, I just want to put my okay in there. I kind of like to talk about it also. And I think skipping committees would be the right way to do it too. Seems a little redundant to do that. So I'm ready to talk about it too.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Barb.
So we have, the $60,000 is designated for people to apply for. Has the the finance department looked at how many people are delinquent with their utility payments and identify, let them know about the fund? Because like it's already been 2 or 3 weeks and I haven't seen any action of anybody requesting the funds. And it's a small amount of money, but yet it would make a difference, I think.
Jeff, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so we have communicated about the CARES money. It's on the city's website. It's been sent out with flyers with the bills. It's also anyone that calls up to the utility department and has questions or is saying that they're having trouble paying their bill, they've been referred to the Family Center to access that funding. You know, it's entirely possible because there isn't that dire need yet where we're not allowed to disconnect anyone's utilities and we're not doing penalties. It's maybe not at the forefront of people's minds yet, but we know that that's going to be coming, and we certainly hope people kind of reach out to us and reach out to the Family Center to help access that funding because it is available.
Yeah, because I mean, by October 23rd, if they don't ask for the money, then it's going to be too bad that, you know, there's $60,000 left on the table. So, and that could go into the, you know, the finance department to cover those bills. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point, Barb. I just don't know how to, you know, how to get the message out more than what we have. We'll just keep on doing it, and hopefully people can get that assistance because it's available. Even though the shutoffs or anything else, they should be taking advantage of it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Kurt.
Yeah, I definitely need more information. I haven't heard any specific money figures of what we don't have yet. So I don't want to dig into the bank until I really know what we don't have.
Sorry, had to get the cursor back on the right screen. So Kurt, what you asking for is,
I want to know what we need money for that we don't have.
Okay. I guess one way of doing that would be look at the strategic priorities and the information that we have and look at what's funded and look at what are the possibilities. I mean, that would be one way of approaching it and giving you some options that you may or may not want to use the money on.
The last I heard, we made some changes, and that will be all right, I thought. And I saw a graph tonight that said shit hits the fan in 23.
I think, yeah, it wasn't stated quite that way, but you're correct. That's when revenues met expenditures, and at that point, moving forward, it was a choice between increasing service delivery. In other words, you know, looking at reduced service levels in general fund areas, or it was called raising revenue.
Right, and some of those monies that we have in the bank might be really important then.
That is true, and that is another option, is that you can hold on to those monies and let them be used in the future. That is another option. Patrick.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up to Councilmember Botetto's question about the relief, the CARES funds. And do we have another, like a backup plan for out of that 60,000, if let's say half of it is not used, do we have any other ways to use that to benefit the community and that falls within the requirements?
We can certainly look for those ways. It's very interesting. I got an update today about our general fund assistance that we're providing to businesses through social media grants. And we have used roughly 20% of that. People are not applying for it. I've asked Mr. Windish and Lana is there any changes that we should make to help businesses out? And that would be another possibility of use of those funds. Very interesting. That's all I can really say at this point. And also just want to follow up on Ms. Potato. We also did printed postcards in English and in Spanish, and that are being distributed at the food bank, as well as some other locations throughout town.
Okay. So I don't see any other hands raised or people waving at me. So Jason, next study session is the 27th. So in terms of thoughts, ideas, suggestions, etc., you would want them by when?
I would be okay if they just wait till the 27th and communicate them. If you have any questions of staff, please reach out to me or Cassandra or Jeff. We're happy to help answer it.
Okay, so bring them on the 27th is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Is that it, or do we have more on the slides?
Yeah, just the last final slide is next steps.
Okay.
So, and I think we've actually already talked about all this. So we're doing the staff budget right now. It'll be department meetings with the mayor in early August. The rate model is currently being worked on through FCS, and that'll be in front of council in late August. And then we'll be starting regular budget meetings through September and October. And in November, we'll be discussing the 2021 property tax levy and hopefully adopting a budget either late November or early December. And remember, unlike the federal government, we have to pass a balanced budget by the end of the year.
There you go. Other than that, it's easy.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, and we'll move on to next item, intergovernmental transfer of Station Lane parking lot to East Pierce Fire and Rescue. I think it's probably the longest titled one we've had this year. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor. Ms. Marquez will be going over this item.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. This is a really quick presentation. It might be the shortest PowerPoint presentation I've ever prepared. It's only 3 slides. But what we want to present tonight is essentially a surplus of city-owned property, but it's called an intergovernmental transfer. It's a different option for a surplus. And I'm sorry that this image got rotated on the PowerPoint. But this is the parking lot that is immediately adjacent and south of the current fire station in Sumner. It's 10 parking stalls. The city has been leasing it to Sounder commuters for years for $100 a month. And it's generally fully leased. We've seen ridership decrease substantially. So right now it's not full, but generally speaking, it is at capacity. East Pierce is interested in purchasing it in order to expand the fire station and employee parking abilities and options. They're really tight on their parcel and would really benefit a lot from this parking lot. So they approached the city and started floating the idea of being able to purchase it from the city. And the city, of course, in response to what we were just speaking about, potential budget deficits due to the COVID-19 pandemic, thought that now was a really good time to start having this conversation. So back in the fall of 2019, this parking lot was appraised by Sound Transit. It was appraised for $213,439. So that appraisal is still recent enough where it can be relied upon as a fair market value of the property. What the city is proposing that council accept or approve is an intergovernmental transfer under RCW 3933 to another governmental agency, i.e. East Pierce Fire and Rescue, of the parking lot for the full market value. Now, there's one caveat to this. Sound Transit needs a small chunk of this parking lot for their future garage project. And they, before we had even started having interest from East Pierce or discussions about this potential sale with East Pierce, Sound Transit had already presented an offer to acquire a small sliver of property for right-of-way improvements, street and sidewalk improvements, amounting to about $11,000 in value. So the proposal is that the council approve the sale of the parking lot to East Pierce for the full $213,439, offset by the amount of money that Sound Transit would be paying for the sliver of property that they need. So it amounts to about $11,000 difference. The next step in this process is a public hearing on July 20th. And so that's the next time you'll see this, after which you will be asked to approve the surplus via intergovernmental transfer to East Pierce. But I'm happy to answer questions tonight and take council's temperature on whether this is something they're interested in pursuing.
Okay, thoughts, questions, council members? Go ahead, Barb.
So is the 219, 750,000, whatever, is that supposed to add up between the 213 less 11? And it doesn't sound like the math I understand. So
no, that's lawyer math. Apparently,
okay.
I totally botched that. So it's 213,439 less 11,689. So I think I just have a typo in there, and I apologize for that.
Should be about 202 or something. Okay, I couldn't.
I made it too quickly, and I'm really sorry for that error.
That's okay.
Okay, I see hand raised. I don't see the video. There you are, Patrick. Okay, just want to make sure that I'm calling on the right person. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm standing up, moving around to stretch out a little bit. So my question is on the budget impact. I know we would have the sale price of the 219,750, but we would also, on the counter to that, is that we would be losing about 26,000 per biennium. Give or take. There's how many spots again?
There's 10 spots. So it's about $1,000 a month that the city makes. And they're leased through the end of the year.
Okay, so about 24,000 in annual revenue that goes to general fund, correct?
Not sure on where it goes. I'll defer to Jeff or Cassandra on that, but you're correct on the amount.
It does go to the general fund, and it's even a little less than that because most people take advantage of our discount of buying the whole year at a time. Okay. So it takes us about 12 years to make that much revenue if we would left the parking rates the same.
The equivalent of selling it, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to be clear on that. It's I know it's kind of a give and take, but there's also benefit to supporting the East Pierce as well as our partner.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Any other comments coming from the council members? Go ahead, Kurt.
Who owns the fire station?
The fire department. East Pierce owns the lot and the station. If it ever ceases to exist as a fire station, the land will revert back to the city. And that's the same proposal that would happen with this parking lot. We would amend the interlocal agreement that we have with East Pierce to include this as part of the underlying property that would revert back to the city. Of course, we'd have to pay for market value for it if it's ever not used as a fire station in the future.
All right, thanks. I forgot that. Thanks.
Okay, other questions, council members? Cindy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just state that I'm in favor of this and would like to see it go forward.
Thanks, Cindy. Okay, other council members? Kurt, oh, that's a thumbs up. Gotcha, Kurt. I'm pretty quick on that one. Barb? Oh, that's okay.
I'm thumbs up.
Got it. I didn't know which digit you're using there. Sorry. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so council will see this on the next council agenda for a public hearing, correct?
Correct. On July 20th, we'll have a public hearing.
Got it. Okay. There we go. Okay. We'll move on to last item on the agenda, which is diversity equity discussion. Call on you, Jason.
Yeah, Mayor, I apologize. I got kicked off the VPN, so just a second here. The joys sometimes.
Ryan is smiling at us again.
Almost there.
How he's able to maintain that's just amazing, isn't it?
Almost eerie.
Oh,
Someone needs to check on him.
yep, there he is. Yeah, it's the real Ryan. See, Jason, that's what happens when you have it on the city's servers and you have to go into VPN to access it versus having it on your laptop.
No. All righty. Everybody should be able to see the presentation now. Sorry about that.
I think we can.
Tonight, we want to spend some time talking about the city's efforts to increase and become more aware of diversity and equity. And we've divided this presentation into a few different parts. Chief Moricki will also be participating in it to kind of go over things that are unique to the police department. So I want to start off just recognizing some history. Racial equity challenges throughout Sumner have been a part of our history. I think everybody knows we were primarily a white settlement as America expanded west. We created this city, was created on land that was formerly belonging to the Puyallup and Muckleshoot tribes. And it was actually named after an abolitionist. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts was a staunch abolitionist and fought for equal rights and to end slavery. I think also many of you know that during World War II, many of our residents of Japanese descent were interned in internment camps, some over in Puyallup and some outside this area. That was a challenging time for us, and there was actually a good story done by NPR a few years back that interviewed one of those gentlemen that was interned. And he talked about how his community would shelter him during the day so he could have ice cream when he would sneak out of the Puyallup Fairgrounds. Just showed some of the character of the city and how our citizens didn't necessarily agree with what was going on to our Japanese neighbors. If you ever talk to the owners of Winsome Grace, they have a lot of stories that detail the time back then. And a lot of history was uncovered in that building as they were remodeling it. And then in 1960s, sometimes this gets misreported, but our city actually was able to keep out a proposed KKK gathering by, of all things, denying outhouses. So it forced them to not be able to meet here in the city. It was not welcomed by the city leadership at the time, obviously, nor would it be today. And they did everything they could to prevent them from meeting here in town. I want to spend a few minutes going over our demographics, because I know this comes up a lot as a question. So the way that this table works is we have city employees, and there's some challenges with that. I'll get into that in just a moment. Then we have City of Sumner from the 2018 census update, our school district, and then Pierce County. I think everybody would agree we are a regional city. We have a train station, so we're a transit hub. We have an MIC with over 16,000 jobs, and obviously people are coming in from all over the region to work there. So we definitely serve a broader region, as does our school district. So our school district includes not just our City of Sumner residents, but it also includes Bonnie Lake, unincorporated, as well as students that are transfers in from other districts. One of the challenges we have with our city employees is up until about 4 years ago, we were not required to report our demographic data to the federal government or the EEOC. And that's because we had less than 100 employees. But that changed. And so we started reporting that in 2015, or actually 2017. But in 2015, there were some changes made to the report. And what that did is that created this gap. We have a lot of tenured employees who we created or we collected demographic data on prior to that is incomplete. For example, 2 or more races was not an option on the EEOC reporting prior to 2015. So that's not even, I think that is underreported for our city employee demographics. The other thing that's interesting is the average tenure of our employee is 12 years. So 50% obviously have more than 12 years, but out of that, 1/3 of our employees actually have more than 20 years. So we have not been collecting or inputting that data regularly. And that's something that we're going to try to fix during open enrollment this year and try to get some better demographic data. The last thing any of our employees, or especially in HR, want to do is be guessing what race people identify with. So we want to make sure that we have good data. Any questions on this slide before I move on?
Don't see any hands up, so go ahead and continue, Jason.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to talk a little bit about what we've done. And I'm not going to talk recent. We're going to talk recently here in a few minutes, but what have we done over the last several years? Some of these items are not specifically about diversity. Some are just meant to increase accessibility for everyone. Let's start with police officer testing. So our entry-level police officers, as part of their written test, have an intercultural sensitivity evaluation. And this is really meant to look at how they view the world and how they view themselves in relation to different cultures that they have experienced in life. All of our police officers get extensive background investigations that look for bias and character traits, as well as psychological screenings that specifically test for biases or tendencies that would lead them to treat other groups differently. And that is something that I think will be expanding in the future. We've talked to our psychologist, and he said there's a lot of chatter lately about what do police psychology screenings look like in the future, and there'll probably be some additional testing that helps identify bias. We're also finding ways to support diversity where they are. Things like the Guadalupe procession, we actively participate and promote every year. The homecoming parade, which represents all the different service groups and clubs at the high school. We make sure that they have a safe environment to participate in. We are at the youth forums and community summit listening to what's important to our youth and the experiences they're having in the community, and trying to address those issues where we can, whether it's street lighting, crosswalk signals, feelings of safety at our shopping areas, or even possible targeting or harassment that they receive on school buses or from our local businesses. We try to understand those issues and take action where we can. We also have a blind hiring process. This is something that we started a little over 2 years ago. When I say a blind hiring process, it means that when somebody applies for a job here, the Human Resources Department will screen the applicant to make sure they meet the minimum qualifications, whether that's education or experience, whatever those are, they make sure they meet the minimum qualifications. The number one thing we actually disqualify people for is not following directions on the application. And that's usually not attaching a driver's abstract or answering the supplemental questions. That's the quickest way that people are disqualified, and the most common reason why people are disqualified. From there, the system actually redacts all names, addresses, dates of birth, even years that they went to school. And we do that because of unconscious bias by the next group of people. And that next group of people is really looking at, they're the subject matter experts, and they're looking to determine who should get an interview. So we want to make sure there's nothing identifying a protected class or maybe even an address where somebody might say, hey, well, I know, people that are of this demographic live in this area. We don't want any of that entering into our hiring process. So that's completely blind. The first time that people actually see a name associated with who's being interviewed and all that other data, including resumes, is actually at the interview stage. And that's when a separate panel, not the person necessarily that did that subject matter expert review, goes through and they interview and make a recommendation of who should move forward. At that point, the top 1 to 3 candidates, depending on the job, start going through a reference check, which does include questions about bias. And then it's the department director who will then make a final interview and a hiring decision, or a hiring recommendation rather, on a candidate. It's important that department director was not involved in the interviews, nor were they involved in the subject matter expert review. So we have 3 different groups of employees that are looking at our applicants, and out of those, it's completely blind before they show up for the interview. Now, there is some challenges with that. We do have a low turnover rate. As you know, we don't hire that many people. We hire between 5 and 10 people a year on average. So we don't do it that often, which can be a challenge. And then also blind hiring, it's a double-edged sword because it doesn't allow us to maybe look for specific characteristics or types of employees that we want to hire and make sure that they get an interview. And there's pros and cons to that. Yes, sir.
Charlotte has a question.
Go ahead.
All right, so, okay, you're starting to touch on, when I saw like blind hiring process, you're starting to touch on issues around recruitment. Here's the thing. This is a huge issue, and by this I don't mean specifically blind hiring. I mean all like equity and whatnot. Like, I can't imagine having this conversation without getting into it for at least an hour to start with, and then an ongoing continuation. And so this is terrible, but I am just to serve everyone well. I don't know what the process or procedure is, or if this is appropriate or not. If we need to get through this tonight, that's fine. I am wondering if the 27th has just, like, instead of coming off of asphalt and budget, if we can either maybe go through the presentation this evening, but do comments and thoughts and digging in on the 27th. So we're not doing all of it in the same night.
Mayor, I'm going to defer to you. I'm going to be very transparent here. I'm actually not going to be here on the 27th. So as long as the mayor and council is okay, if I'm not here, that conversation can happen then. We certainly have capable department directors that can help lead that conversation and answer questions.
So can we go through their presentation tonight, but then provide sort of have like a work session around it on the 27th, and we'll have you can have our notes.
Yeah, and I think it would be helpful to understand what the goal, so staff can be prepared. What are the things that you want to talk about in more detail at a future meeting? Maybe at the end of this, we could jot those down. That would help.
Okay, thanks.
Melanie, you had your hand raised, but now it's not.
I was just gonna say that I appreciate that staff has put this together and has moved this forward on the calendar to make sure that it gets talked about in a timely manner. I also understand Councilmember Newman's position of wanting to give this the time it deserves and wanting to make sure everyone is in the headspace to have a discussion for an appropriate amount of time. So That's all.
Okay. No, and I appreciate both of your comments in that regard. I look at this as the start of a conversation, you know, and Jason's going to run through it. And then I agree with him. It'd be great to have some idea where people have interest, et cetera, so that we can be somewhat prepared at the next session. But anyway, at least that's where I'm coming from. Okay. Okay. Go ahead and continue, Jason.
Sure. A couple other things that we have already done. Annually, we do a bias-based policing review, and Chief Murky can go into more detail what that looks at, but in his slides. But that's something that we do annually. We make sure that we're accessible through our language line service. We are definitely a value-based culture, and we also do value-based evaluations, which is unique for a city. And when we go through our values, while the word diversity and equity is not currently in those, we are looking at ways to incorporate diversity and equity in those values through the supporting statements. And that's something I'll touch on here in just a moment. Police accreditation, we are one of few accredited police agencies in the state of Washington. And that is important because that means that we are reviewed by an outside panel that makes sure that we are following our policies and that we are following best practices in law enforcement. I think it's a credit to a city our size to have a council that is majority of women. That is amazing and something I'm proud of. I'm proud to work for a council that is a majority of women. Definitely, we've through accessibility, looking for an increased range of feedback options, so that Sumner Connect, social media, trying to change the way we do our public outreach to make sure that we are reaching the broadest group possible, as well as all the possible underrepresented demographics in our communities. That's thinking about differently about where we post things and how we post things. That's something that we're continually trying to evaluate and be better at. And then also we adopted gender neutral restrooms in all of our city facilities. We're also a wealth city, and through AWC, and AWC defines wellness as social, physical, intellectual, spiritual, and educational. Most cities focus mainly on the physical side of wellness. However, for years we have focused on all 5 areas and been noticed by AWC for how well we are able to hit all 5 of these areas in our wellness program. And this is something that when we have new employees, particularly ones that come from other cities, they definitely notice and they comment on the culture in Sumner is very different from where they worked previously. And this comes down to also the people we hire. We hire for fit, we hire for values, and that's something that makes us unique for cities. I'd also want to say that we promote relationships across different departments, and that helps with also diversity of opinions. A lot of cities, there's this unwritten divide between city hall and field crews, and we really make a conscious effort to not have that divide and look for ways to build understanding between our field and our city hall crews. Staff training and learning. This is something that we are constantly working on and evaluating. In 2018, we started putting all of our employees through attitudes towards differences. This is a class that it's curriculum that Pierce County Human Resources put on. And this is something that up until last year, our staff was able to attend the county trainings. They've since changed that just recently and limited that just to Pierce County employees. So we're currently looking for a replacement for that, but that was a great training that a lot of employees walked away from saying, wow, that was a great class to go through. And You don't always hear that when people get sent to diversity training. They kind of come up with a wall up, and this is one where people walked away saying, wow, that's the best training I've been to on the topic. Preventing harassment and discrimination in the workplace, all staff go through that every 3 years. And then we have some other engagement training to make sure that we are more inclusive in our engagement and outreach. We've been putting our communication staff and some of our PD staff. When I say PD, it's our folks that are managing all of our social media and written communication. All of our new hires also have to go through a harassment, discrimination, retaliation for employees training, and our supervisors are required to go through supervisory training on the topic every 3 years. Also this year, for the first time ever, we did 360-degree leadership evaluations on all of our directors. We'll be looking at possibly doing that in future years with the mid-managers, but that actually has an equity component to it and a diversity component to it, which talking to those that were evaluated found useful. And just for your information, our Title VI officer is Jeff Steffens, and our ADA Plan and Compliance officer is Derek Berry. I'm going to turn it over to Chief Maricki to go over the police training because he can speak about it much better than I can. So with that, Chief Maricki.
Thank you, Jason. So we just kind of put together a little slide of what police are currently getting at the academy, and as well the new what's called the Law Enforcement Training and Community Safety Act, which we call LATASCA, that was passed in January of 2019, that has a new requirement for annual training for police officers. And that's what you see in that block of 40 hours. 24 hours of that is patrol, what we call patrol tactics, that largely emphasizes de-escalation. It's hands-on practical training, and that's creating time and distance and safety and how to be able to verbally de-escalate. When we talk about there's 16 hours of that 40-hour block is spent on 4 hours of it is training on the historical intersection of policing and African-American community. They've got Dr. Bryant Marks under contract to do a 4-hour piece there that talks about not only the historical aspects, but also a lot of the unconscious bias that affects our decision-making and worldviews. Then there's the remaining 12 hours goes on to talk about alternatives to booking, understanding the rites and rituals and ceremonies of Indigenous people, and developing relationships with the LGBTQ and youth communities. As far as ongoing training for our officers, the state legislature mandated 8-hour training for each officer already certified prior to 2016. And that requirement was to be done by 2017. And we've met 100% compliance with that. And then there's an ongoing 2-hour annual training that's done through CJTC through their online portal. And then the bias-based policing, the officers have to review and acknowledge our policy annually. It's one of our accreditation standards. The next slide. And then we have some elective training as well. Last year, CJTC and King County paid for Bryant Marks to come up and do several in-person sessions. Myself, Deputy Chief, and sergeants were able to attend that. At the Academy in 2016, and then again as part of that LATASCA 2019, they've made a number of significant changes. They incorporated Blue Courage, or a portion of Blue Courage, into their BLIA Academy training that deals with really a shift of a mindset from a warrior to a guardian standpoint, as far as being guardians of democracy and guardians of the Constitution. That's something that Sue Rohr brought, and it was also something that came out of President Barack Obama's 21st century policing recommendations. And then recruits also started receiving the bias training, the increased crisis intervention training. And then part of the Law Enforcement Training Community Safety Act was the legislature mandated that out of the 720 hours basic law enforcement academy training, 200 of those hours must touch on a whole host of areas, but the majority is de-escalation and crisis intervention and mental health. So officers that graduated from December of 19 met that requirement. The director of CJTC, Sue Roars, mentioned or of the belief that the majority of that was already built in different components of the basic law enforcement curriculum. They just sometimes went by a different name. Wanted to give some contextual framework. I always report out on the number of activity that our police department is engaged in. Of course, the Public Safety Committee is always briefed monthly on our monthly statistics. But what's not always captured in those statistics are our complaints, how we review those, use of force, accommodations. And so I'm going to want to share that tonight, but I wanted to start with this basic foundation of looking at our overall activity in our community with 20 commissioned police officers. And I can tell you, I don't have any stats included in those numbers. I can tell you how many emails I wrote and how many complaints I got. But these are basically the, you know, the working members of the department that are out engaging the community all the time. And this is important just because it gives some framework for when the next slide, when we talk about our encounters of having to use force, our encounters that result in complaints from the public and whatnot. So I'll tell you that pretty consistently, our numbers are pretty consistent in Sumner. If you look at our traffic enforcement as a portion of our total events, and an event is any time a call is generated with our dispatch. So whether it's an officer saying, hey, I'm going to be on a traffic stop on Main, or if it's somebody calling and say, hey, somebody broke in my shed last night, stole my lawnmower. We consistently average about 53% is calls generated from someone calling the police dispatch and requesting a service. And about the other 47% is officer initiated activity, whether they're stopped to issue a notice of infraction for a parking violation, or they contact a citizen that flags them down, or anything that's basically on viewed. So it shows the total of contacts there, number of traffic stops, number of results in comparison to the total number of calls for service for the year. So the next stop we look at, and every year I do an analysis to provide to the mayor. And Jason recommended that we include that in a public link, just for better transparency and understanding. But every year, based on one of our accreditation standards, is that I, as the chief law enforcement officer, need to do a critical assessment of our biggest risk, high risk activities. And that's vehicle pursuits, use of force, review any complaints and those investigations. I throw accommodation in there just to balance the scales, and that we do an analysis of any bias-based policing. And so I want to share that information with you. And you can tell we have a very low incidence. And I took 4 years comparison. Very low levels of vehicle pursuits. And each of these vehicle pursuit, the officer fills out a pursuit report, the supervisor fills out a pursuit critique, it gets reviewed by the deputy chief, and then it finally gets reviewed by me. So there's at least 3 levels of scrutiny on that individual officer's actions, of whether their decision to initiate or to get involved with the pursuit meets our policy, which is very restrictive. Then we go into use of force incidents. I've outlined 3 basic levels of what's often referred to as a continuum. Basic, any use of force in my policy is defined anything that goes beyond compliant handcuffing or transporting of an individual or a pat search. So anytime that they need to apply any level of force, they are required to separately report it. So you can see we've, based in context of the number of, even in 2019, which was a low level because of our staffing shortages, 360 arrests. And it doesn't always have to be arrest. Use of force is often a necessary component to doing a civil commitment of someone that's a danger to themselves or other. So looking at all this activity that we're engaged in, all the things the community asks us to do, from moving people along to enforcing our laws, there was only 7 incidents that they had to use more than verbal control. They needed to use an empty-handed technique or tactic to be able to affect the lawful purpose, whether it was to arrest somebody or restrain them for a commitment. We had 7 uses of level 2 force. The only one strike was a strike with a flashlight. There was no OC pepper spray, no canines. The other, there was, I think 7 uses of or 5 uses of a taser. 2 were accidental. The officers are required to check their taser before their patrol cycle once a week. And sometimes they forget to take that little dart cartridge off the tip of it before they do their test. They're required to report unintended discharges too, or accidental discharges. 2 were just red dotting, which means putting the sight on a suspect and threatening the use. And only 1 was an actual use of a taser for the entire year for the entire department. And then the level 3s, what we see most in those is somebody that displays a firearm to a human being as a threatened use of force. And that's typically in your high risk traffic stops, felony stops. If they're merely clearing a building that ends up being empty and they had their gun down at the low, they're not required to report that. It's only when they threaten use of force against a human being. We did not have any actual level 3 other than the aiming or pointing a firearm. And that's what the majority of the level 3s have. In addition, and we haven't had any use of carotids, haven't used any less lethal like bean bags. Most of those are just incidents where the officer drew or threatened or pointed their firearm. Is there any questions on the use of force data?
I don't see any hands raised or anything, Chief. So go ahead.
Okay, I'll keep moving forward. So the next critical area that I look at as a gauge of if we're doing the right things in the community and our service is level of complaints. These are complaints, and we accept any manner of complaint, electronic, written form. I've initiated complaints before from emails. Sometimes we'll get an angry customer event and hang up the phone at the front desk if they don't provide information. That typically won't result in a formal complaint, at least one that raises to the level of being investigated. But those are pretty low numbers. Both complaints in 2019 were from citizens and both regarded discourtesy. The 6 complaints you see in 2018, 2 were internal. They were officers that violated policy and had a complaint filed and investigated, and in at least one of the case resulted in discipline. And then the other 3 were complaints from citizens that an officer failed to do something that they felt they should have done, or discourtesy, or there was one complaint where it was basically a parental dispute and one parent wasn't satisfied with the outcome of the case. And it goes on 2014, 2017. So those are pretty low numbers. If you look at our collisions, those are unusually higher numbers. The majority of those are very minor collisions, but any collision, any impact with a vehicle with another object has to be separately reported. And we have a 3-person panel, a union representative, HR risk person, and a supervisor that sits on a board and reviews those collisions. Because again, like human behavior, driving is a behavior. We want to look, do we have issues with our equipment? Do we have issues with our training? Do we have issues with the person behind the wheel? And so we critically examine all of those things. Vehicles and driving is a very high risk, high liability area. So we want to take a look at those. I'll tell you the majority of them are minor backing collisions, or officer hit a Boyard at a pump, pulling in to fill up the car with gas. They've all been very minor, fortunately. One was one of the complaints that resulted in discipline. It was over a vehicle being damaged. And then the other thing I look at is commendations. And likewise, I get a lot of anecdotal, hey, your guys are doing great. And I get emails, the officers responded to their person's call and they know me, or they took the time to find out who the chief was and sent them an email. Those, I have volumes of those, but to get an accommodation, 9 times out of 10, it's a citizen recognizing an officer for doing their job or doing their job well, which I certainly appreciate. But for accommodation, I really look at where an officer goes above and beyond their normal job to really reach out and help a citizen, and that citizen lets me know about it. Then we'll do an official accommodation. And those numbers are pretty consistent or meet or exceed typically what our complaint level is, and it's just sheer coincidence. So this next thing is very important. And we started doing this in 2017. That's why there's only 3 years of comparison data instead of 4. But one of the critical things, it's one thing to have a policy against bias policing, but it's another to make sure that you're following it and that the officers are following it. The idea of having equal enforcement of the law without regard to race or gender or any protected group or any group. And one of the things I do that is by complaints. I haven't had any complaints that an officer had a racial bias or motive in their enforcement or their treatment of a citizen. I haven't had any complaints with regard. So that tells me, generally speaking, that officers are doing the right things for the right reasons. And then the other thing we do is we look at, and it's hard when we look at all those contacts we have of what's the best way to collect data. And that's a shortcoming. But one way we do have to collect data is when we issue a ticket, because one of the fields in the ticket is for gender, race, height, weight, date of birth, different information. And one of the things that by and large officers have a lot of discretion on, they don't get to choose when they go to a domestic violence call. But one thing they do have a lot of discretion is in traffic enforcement. Who, when, where, what they stop for. And so we can take that data and compare it against what we know. So that's what this graph attempts to do, and I attempt to do every year when I do this analysis, is we've got statistics that were taken from the U.S. Household Community Survey for each of the respected years. It's the U.S. Census Bureau American Community Survey. Comes out in July of every year. And that's the one that provides demographics about our community, our resident community, median household income, education, and racial demographics. And so I can take that information and compare against individuals that have received either a criminal moving traffic or a civil infraction, such as speeding. Criminal would be, it's much more limited. That's why the numbers are so low. It would be a driving under the influence, driving with a suspended license, not having an interlock device, those types of what our legislature deemed to be criminal moving offenses. And as Jason pointed out on the introductory slides, when we look at what are our demographic mix, both in the city and regionally and with our school district, we don't really have a good method of determining what the racial demographics is of our daytime workforce in the MIC. We know that our city population has consistently hovered around 10,000. And that's the only thing that those that choose to respond to this survey could attempt to get demographic information from. What we don't know is the people that commute regionally into our MIC for employment and how that affects these numbers. I can tell you anecdotally, we have a very diverse manufacturing industrial center between the mix of warehousing and the transportation. A lot of it's transportation oriented businesses. Brings in a lot of diversity that would not normally be reflected in our nighttime city populations. Is there any yeah.
Yeah, Chief, Melanie, go ahead.
Thank you. So Chief, I'm trying to draw the parallels between the demographic percentages on the slide that Jason spoke about, just like you were talking about here. And I totally understand that our 1.24% Black population isn't a fair comparison to traffic stops because for obvious reasons that you just stated about our workforce. But if I look at the county number, I would think that would be more in line. So I just want to make sure before I assume things, are these numbers apples and apples? If I'm looking at 7.7% Black in the county, and I'm looking that we pull over out of our percentage of folks that we pull over that are Black are 11.6, are those apples and apples that I can compare?
You mean as far as where the source of the data?
I'm saying that if I want to make sure I'm reading this right. 2019, if we're looking at Black, the line for Black, and it says 11.6% criminal, right? Criminal charges. And I look at the population of even the county versus Sumner. Can I compare those two numbers? I saw Jason shaking his head, so I want to understand better. And this could be per Charla, and I guess my follow-up comment later, this can be something we discuss in depth later, but I just want to be careful with these numbers and make sure that we all understand them. So maybe that can be a tabled topic for later to think about.
Do you have a quick response? Because I hear what Melanie's saying. We can save a lot of stuff, but can you provide some clarification on that?
I can. First off, what you're looking at here under the criminal and infraction do not reflect traffic stops. Okay, there's no mechanism right now to collect that data at the traffic stop level. This is only the enforcement level. That's what I wanted to, that's why I was shaking my head. It doesn't equate to that. And like the chief just mentioned, criminal charges are if they violated some sort of criminal code, usually which is determined after the traffic stop, whether it's an interlock device, driving while license suspended, those types of things. It could be a DUI as well. But so you're kind of accurate, and there's some caveats there.
Okay, thanks.
And, you know, percentages are always tricky because with these low numbers, I mean, if that were a 19 or an 18, you know, it's going to go down, you know, pretty substantially.
Thanks, Chief.
But they're pretty consistent you know, we've had change of personnel during this time. We've had, we had fewer officers in 2019. We were pretty much up to staff. In 2017, we had a lot higher traffic numbers. Same thing with 18. And even with a couple hundred, just more enforcement on between these years, the percentages remain relatively stable. And the other thing is that our DOL does not provide racial demographics. So this is dependent on officers entering data into the sector tickets. So that's why there's some unknowns. And how that could influence that, that's another question.
If you take your hand down, I can see who's behind it. Oh, it's you, Barb. Go ahead.
So just to be clear, like under 2019, the rates are, reflecting on like 173 criminal arrests. And then, but over here, we're for Sumner and the county. So we have 80% white. I mean, this is the amount of, or the percent of each different ethnic group. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so that it really doesn't reflect over here on the criminal part, like those. You wouldn't say that we would only have 1.4% of, a criminal stop for somebody, like if they were African, Asian American, or Asian Pacific. So, but I think now I understand what the last two columns are. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's the goal is, and ideally the enforcement would reflect the community demographics. But the reality is that one is in a community such as ours that has such, with the MIC and the commuter, being a commuter hub, is we have a lot of traffic that's not just captured in the community household survey for our 10,300 per population.
Yeah.
And so that's a challenge. It's always a challenge getting good data, but the underlying purpose of doing this is to see across the board and compared to your community composition demographically, are you having an even, consistent application of your laws? Is your enforcement being evenly applied to all members of the community, irregardless of race? And that's part of my critical review to make that determination. Getting good data is always a challenge. I think it always will be, unless we can come up with a way to collect better data on what our true demographics are. And also collecting data on all of our contacts, not just the ones that result in enforcement.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
The next slide, unless there's any other questions, Mayor.
Don't see any up there, Chief. Go ahead.
Okay.
So we've talked about kind of where we've been. Now I want to talk about where we're going. Because I do believe this is a movement, not a moment. As staff, several of us have been doing the 21-day equity challenge. We've been encouraging all of our staff to participate in that. And that's just about wrapped up, actually. Our leadership team, this week, we are starting a book study on white fragility. And talking to folks that have already started reading it has been very enlightening to them. I started it today and got some things out of it right away. So I think that's going to be a good move for our leadership team. Several senior staff members were at the Unity rally that was held on June 5th that went from the Ryan House area down to Loyalty Park. The mayor has done a few e-news articles on this, as well as Chief Maricki has done some messaging through their social media, as well as e-news articles from him and his perspective. We have started up a START committee, and just to remind you, our START committees are strategic action recommendation teams. We stood one up to look at the areas of diversity and equity. And I was very pleased to have over a dozen staff members representing every single department in the city who volunteer to be on that committee. And that committee recommended that we actually form an employee-ran diversity and equity committee. And they are having their first meeting next week. And I think from what I've heard, I haven't seen the final list yet, but the number of people interested in participating in that has grown beyond that initial dozen that were on the START committee. And they're looking at doing several things, including looking at our value statements to see how we can make sure that they truly reflect the importance of diversity and equity. They're going to continue to review our practices and our policies, host events to expand knowledge, including possibly looking at doing an Ask A series. If you don't know what that is, just Google Ask A, and then you'll be linked to public radio that does a number of those. And then we are also in very early discussions with the school district regarding their diversity task force and how do we become an active member on that. They're in a bit of a change situation right now with that, and looking to restart it as well. Also want to touch on some things that the police department's doing. And actually, I'll turn this back over to Brad to talk about the PC Fit team.
Jason, just before I get into that, I wanted to acknowledge our only remaining citizen participant in tonight's study session is Seth Foley. And Mr. Foley and Mr. DeWitt live on North Street, DeWitty, excuse me. And they had wrote Mayor Pugh a letter in response to both his statement and my open letter to the community, and thanking us for that, but also, you know, rightfully wanting to know what more is being done or has been done. And this letter being truly arrived via UPS with nothing more than a return address, no phone number, no email. So I cranked out a letter back, and I knew we were having this discussion tonight, and I knew if I mailed it, it wouldn't get to him on time. So I had an officer deliver it to his door and ask him if he wanted to attend tonight. And I appreciate his engagement. A lot of people have the questions, but they don't want to take the time to get the answers. So I wanted to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that that information I shared about our complaints, we've had a number of public records requests with 10 years of discipline on officers, 20 years of complaint history, 10 year of King 5, Andrea's wrapping up one on the use of force data. It's out there. I think we've got great track record to run on here. And so, but it's out there, and I wanted the council to also be aware of it. Some of the other things going on, been discussing this with our Public Safety Committee. The part of that Law Enforcement Training and Community Safety Act, there's a whole separate piece of legislation that deals with independent police investigations on use of force incidents. And a key component of that is having a civilian involved with that process, what we call a community representative. And so we put that out in our social media, what you see there, that Twitter feed, and we got 8 applications. And so we're going forward with Councilmember Peterson and myself in going through a selection process to find out who to select someone to serve that very important as part of the investigation, independent investigation team. I've also shared that we're, reviewing our current practices. I immediately put a hold on the carotid control technique. We're going to review all our policies. To me, they don't stand always alone. They work in unity with some of our other policies and how that shapes the culture and the mission of our department. So we're looking at all of those. We employ a very sophisticated policy service called Lexapol. I shared that in my letter. I shared the updates with the Public Safety Committee. They've got a tremendous think tank. We know a lot of change is going to be coming as part of this this movement. And so want to work together in unison and not separate little bits and pieces. And so we're looking at all our current policies, use of force. So I wanted to share that with you. If there's any questions?
Questions of the chief?
I will also say that we are in the early stages of exploring body cameras as well, just trying to learn more about it and what technology is out there right now.
Yep, sorry about that. I missed that bullet point. I had two web presentations, one from Axon and the other from GTAC, just to get some idea of what technology is out there and how much it'll cost, and haven't heard back from them yet.
Good. Thanks, Chief.
You bet.
So Latanya, I'm gonna probably not pronounce her last name right. I think it's Pegates, known as the unconscious bias trainers, says the way to make this effort sustainable for an organization rather than a moment of popularity that checks a box is to be intentional about it. So while I know that council wants to talk about this at a future meeting, I think what I would want to leave council with is how else do we as council, staff, and community remain intentional about racial diversity and equity? With that, we're open to questions and any discussion.
I do not see any hands. Oh, Melanie, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go through my list of specific things I think we can be doing, or questions that I have. So the first is training. I think in order for council to be able to make sure that our policies are not doing harm, we need to be trained. So I don't think we can have a staff that's majority white, a council that's majority white, a mayor that's white, making choices for people of color and not know that we are affecting people differently. So I think professional training for council and staff is critical on equity and diversity, and this would be something that's ongoing. I'd like to further discuss police training. It was such great information. Thank you, Chief, on providing the hours and all of that. It was really detailed and wonderful. So I think there's more discussion to have there. More follow-up on, like you're saying, how are we going to track how we're keeping up with other jurisdictions? Like you already mentioned that you took out the carotid as an option, the carotid hold, but also best practices on budget allocations, removing the thin blue line reference from the station, things like that. I'd like to have a discussion with the arts committee. I recently had a conversation with a Black person about art in particular and how art tells us who's welcome. And so we have a lot of wonderful art in the city of Sumner, and it speaks to our past, and that's fine, but I think it's time that we could have something that speaks to people that are here and people of the future. And then last, I want to talk with the council and staff on how can we include voices of color in our choices, knowing that we don't have them on staff and council. What would that look like? That's all.
Thanks, Melanie. I appreciate you, sharing that list. I do. Anybody else? Go ahead, Charlotte.
No, I took notes during the presentation, and I'll just email, but I want to go through it again and look at it because some of it's also not based on their presentation. But I will, as a courtesy, email it to all council members and staff, so everyone kind of has like a heads up, so we're not starting all over again as we continue the conversation at the next study session. But I appreciate the presentation.
Good. Okay, anybody else? And I appreciate the presentation, all the work that went into it, and also Melanie, your comments and your list. And it's true. I think your statement that a white mayor and a white council, how do you get the perspective in terms of moving forward? And I think those are really true words. I know I've had some conversations with a couple Black community members, and I have some more lined up, because I felt by me doing that, I'm going to learn more than I can by reading a lot of things. Although there's a lot on the reading list, and I continue working my way through that to gain greater awareness. So anyway, I will have completed those conversations, I think, by the next study session, and I think that'll help me in terms of some perspective and ideas for moving forward. Barb.
Well, I think we're talking a lot about the Black community, but we also really need to address the Hispanic community, because they are, their presence in the town. And I think a lot of them, just because of language, that sometimes they don't really get the understanding of, some of the issues. So I just like, that to be acknowledged as well.
Very true statement. Thanks, Barb. Okay, anything else? Any comments? Jason? Nope.
Nope, nothing, Mayor.
Okay. Didn't see a hand raised, but all of a sudden it went to your window. So, okay. Okay, I don't see anything else for that particular item. City Administrator report. Okay, Jason, I will call on you.
And nothing tonight.
Okay, good answer. Okay, agenda setting, we go to calendar issues. Anybody have any calendar issues in terms of either committee or anything that's on the council future agendas? Any issues anybody has, any conflicts? Wow, everybody's getting weary, I can tell. There is no executive session. So that being the case, this meeting is adjourned at 8:49. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Be safe.
Good night, everyone.